back after the fact, again, per usual, you can kind of just fast forward for a few minutes as we kind of wait for people to get on here. Yeah, icebreakers. We've tended to do icebreakers for it's always like in the early minutes of these things, and I'm like, oh, that's right, I need to get an icebreaker because I never remember to actually look it up.
Are you Googling icebreakers right now?
I do, yeah. Icebreaker questions. The only list of icebreaker questions you'll ever need.
I don't know if that's true. But...
Oh, here we go. What's a fictional family you would what's a fictional family you would like to be a member of?
The Seavers from Growing Pains.
The Seavers?
Yeah, Mike Seaver and Karen, and yeah, Alan Thicke was the dad.
Okay.
I mean, just having Alan Thicke as a dad, it's kind of like he was like the quintessential TV dad back in the day. I would probably, yeah. So shows my age.
The first fictional family that came to mind was the Swiss Family Robinson family.
You just want
first thing that came to mind. Yeah, I would love to live in a jungle. Even though weren't they there like by a shipwreck? Like that wasn't even their choice. So. Yeah.
You'd be building so much stuff there. That's why you would.
Oh, it'd be a lot of fun. Yeah. Building tree houses.
From that, and like it would be all over the place. So
just MacGyver everything is basically. Yeah. Which is like most of our house. Like it's just MacGyver things like, I'm not going to pay $100 for that. I'll pay $80 in materials and do it myself for $100 worth of labor by the time I'm done.
Perfect. It gives you something to do.
Exactly. That's kind of which actually is a perfect segue to what we want to talk about today. So kind of what these next couple of weeks are going to look like, or we're going to attempt, is around the idea that winter is coming. We succumbed to the classic meme of using a Game of Thrones reference for something. If it's good enough for the president, it's good enough for us. So around this theme, winter is coming, preparing for the idea that this pandemic is not going anywhere. It's not going away anytime soon. Projections that a vaccine won't be available until the second quarter or third quarter of next year. Which means more than likely we're going to be in phase 2, if we might move into phase 3, but we have no way of knowing when. And then what does that even look like come winter when you can't really gather outside anyways and indoor restrictions are still pretty restricted. And so not so much this conversation over these next 3 weeks aren't so much going to be about how do we strategically move forward, like what kind of groups do we have, like where do we meet, how do we meet, those not so much those kinds of things. At least that's not where my mind is going with this conversation, but more what can each of us do individually in our own homes with the people that we live with, or in communal spaces that you find yourselves in that aren't necessarily like church sanctioned small groups or whatever, but like what are different ways that we can kind of prepare for and be our best selves coming out of and working through winter. And so that's kind of what this week and next week will look like. And then on October 6th, I believe it is, in 2-3 weeks, however time works, we're going to have Heather Barnes with us.
It's so true.
She is a local therapist. She is my former boss at the Seattle school. So if you're familiar with the Seattle school, she was my former boss, and then she left to grow her private practice. And so we're going to have her on as a therapist to kind of walk us through some ideas of maybe how to kind of cope with the mental health aspect of it. Because, shocker, Aaron and I are not mental health experts.
And what'll be great is, yeah, it's loud outside. What's great is that she's the last part of the whole thing. So you'll get to see how crazy and weird our ideas are, how we're actually coping, and like cross-reference that with like an actual professional and be like,
that knows what they're doing.
Or that lines up a little.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think we all just need to take everything that we say in regards to like mental health specifically with a grain of salt. And these are just kind of our ideas as like community organizers, if you want to use like a secular term of some kind. But yeah, so I think I guess maybe some questions we could walk through. Like, Aaron, what are ways that you have found to, or maybe resources that you have found that are helpful to kind of cope with large life events, such as like, or maybe existential crises that you experience, like a loneliness or something like that? Kind of what are some places that you tend to go to for equipping?
Yeah, one of the things that I found that's really important for me is the ability to get like away and find silence, like to carve out spaces for silence where I can quite literally just sit and allow everything that is going on around me to just kind of quiet down. I've got to eschew my phone. I've got to throw it out the window kind of thing. I can't be near it. Or at least just turn off the notifications and listen to music, or listen to typically something like Oliver Arnold has been my soundtrack. And
that's a jam.
Yes. Oh, he's so good. But like those sorts of things that allow me to create space. And I think one of the things that, like, as I look forward to winter, one of the things that I'm really nervous about and in some ways preparing for is there's three of us in a 900 square foot apartment. There's only really one room in the whole house or apartment that we can like relax in, and you have to relax together, right? Like everybody has to be on the same page at the same time in order to do that. And so it's really difficult to carve out space in this place. And so as I look forward to like the winter, I'm like, I don't know what that means. Like maybe we're gonna have to get away a little bit. We've been stockpiling vacation time throughout the year, mainly because we haven't been able to go anywhere for the most part throughout the majority of this. And so maybe we find a weekend or two here or there where we get that quiet and that silence. The fires will be out, be able to go into the mountains, do something up there. We're kind of quiet, but that's been really important for me. And that's actually been something that I've learned from the Enneagram. So like as an Enneagram 3, it's really important to be able to shut everything off, the outside world, and ground yourself in your own thoughts and in your own self, and just sit there in that silence. And so that's been a really important like epiphany in some respects for myself. That's something that I need.
And that's something that like you discovered out of like self-examination and self-growth. Like that's something that you didn't realize until you began to do the work of like, who am I? What do I need? What are my like tendencies and all these kinds of things?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How about you? What are you looking at?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you and I are in a similar kind of boat where we, are married with a kid. And so we've got like, I like work in my bedroom. So, and yeah, you are working in your bedroom as well. And so even though it was difficult in the past to like that work-life balance, because we were kind of already working from home being, pastors, but we could tend to go out. But it's even amped to another degree where like I have a full-time job that I then started doing like at home as well on top of church. And so the balance of work and life has kind of been this constant struggle. And I think what I anticipate kind of happening, and I think we got a little bit of a taste of it with the smoke. So like there were 2 weeks that like we just didn't go outside. Like I started going into work 3 days a week. And so I have that like leave kind of opportunity. But that's still not restful because then you're just working for 8 hours. But so I think one of the things that I anticipate happening over the next 9 months is going to be something similar to what we experienced in the last 2 weeks. And yeah, we have a very similar, like, our living room is the one space, and then Forrest is just running amok through most of the day. And so we're trying to find ways to utilize our building. So like we have the privilege of like having a building that I think is more or less open to like certain limitations, but like how can we utilize the lounge area? How do we utilize like the lobby area so that we can get out of this space? That's still like the three of us together, which I think is something that we value, which is like restful for us, for the three of us to do things together. But in that, there's also the Enneagram side, right? Where like, the two of us, Talissa and I, probably should have our times alone. And then how do we navigate those and, organize or make that happen? And we're finding like small ways to do that, where I work, from home on Tuesdays and Fridays. And so those tend to be the days that like she goes out and does something so that she can get away from Forrest. Cause he's a handful. And so she'll like go out and like today she went and got a haircut, and like she'll go or like make some returns for things that we purchased via our retail therapy. And so we're finding those little ways, but I think, it's going to just amp to another level, when it comes to winter.
I think the smoke part is really insightful. Like what we've experienced these past 12 days is really going to be what we're going to experience for the next 4 months.
Yeah.
In some respects. And granted, we'll be able to go outside a little bit more, like that sort of stuff. But it's not like we're going to.
But it'll still be very limited in comparison to what was available in the summer.
Especially when the darkness hits at 4 p.m. Like I think that's going to be the crazy part. Is like the amount of time, or the time in which we would go outside to just be outdoors is going to be so much more limited, and I think that's going to be something to pay attention to.
Yeah, and then I also am very aware that like there are people that don't have the problem that we have, where we have people that we're around all the time and then trying to figure out how do we rest in the same space. We have many people that have the opposite problem, where they're by themselves all the time and are longing for that community aspect. And we like Zoom or an online format isn't necessarily like the solution, right? Like I think we're that we might be experiencing. So like we went down in a dip where everyone was like, I'm sick of Zoom, I'm sick of web things. And then we stopped doing them. And there might be like a resurgence, I think. We're like, oh, well, it's better than nothing. So there might be a little bit of a bend back up, but I can't speak for someone that's living alone necessarily. But yeah, I think for all of us though, there's a lot of self-discovery or self-learning that could be done in learning. So similar how most of us are taught in school, whether in high school, if you had a great high school experience, or as children, or even in college, like you were taught how to learn, right? You learned how to learn. And I think in the same way, in this season, we need to learn how to rest. And so we need to learn what ways do I rest? Because you and I can't necessarily provide a solution for every single person that like, this is the way that you rest, right? Or this is the way that you speak to Jesus. Like we can't necessarily offer that for everybody.
I think it's also important to define what rest is in this space, right?
Yeah.
Because it feels like rest is not inactivity, right? So as we sit in these spaces in our apartments, and whether we're working or just vegging on the couch, binging Cobra Kai, amazing. By the way. No matter what it is that we're doing in the space, that's not necessarily rest. Like, what's the thing that actually fills you up? Like Jürgen Moltmann wrote in the book The Source of Life, talking about how rest, like real rest, true rest, is what gives you life. It's not sitting in a vegetative state. Like I think the vegetative state is what's important. Like that's not rest. sleep isn't necessarily rest. Like it's a part of rest. It's a component, but rest is more holistic than that.
Yeah.
You have to look at rest from a mind, heart, body, spirit kind of a holistic understanding. And I think defining rest differently allows us to see like, oh, getting out of the house. So last week, towards the end of the smoke, I was going nuts. Like I found myself just super agitated at everything. I was getting angry at the smallest thing. I was just like, I was so tense. And I was like, I have to get out of here. And Tracy goes, just go for a drive. Just go take a drive. And I was like, well, that's a good idea. So I hopped in the car. I drove up to Magnolia. I sat in the overlook, and I looked at the smoke. I had a book that I didn't read. I listened to a podcast, and I just kind of sat there in the car. And granted, I couldn't get out and walk around, which I really wanted to do, but I was able to at least be outside. I was away from everybody. I stayed out there for like an hour and a half. It was 2-hour parking, so I was okay. But no meter. Yeah. So like that's like understanding rest from that kind of perspective is also good. It's self-awareness.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's something I've learned like probably like 5-6 years ago. I would say like the way that I rested was by like watching The Office for 3 hours after getting off work, right? And I would defend it and be like, no, like that's actually like how I rest. But I think, and granted, like sometimes, again, like everything comes with an exception, right? Like there's always a caveat. Like there may be times where like that's all you can do. Like to actively rest in and of itself may be exhausting in that moment. But I think what I found for myself is that I actually enjoy working with my hands, because so much of what I do, and many of us do these days, is working at a computer. And so we're using a keyboard, we're using a mouse. Like there's very few tactile things that we're touching and moving and creating. And especially if you're a creative person that like enjoys making things. I found that if I can find little projects that I can make something out of, that is one of the few things that I can get out of my head and fully focus on whatever it is that I'm making.
Right.
And like for me, again, like understanding a little bit about who I am using the Enneagram, like being an Enneagram 5, I live in my head. Like I struggle to have like an embodied experience. And so having learned that through the Enneagram, I've then taken those things and principles, live in my environment by like creating something or making something. And those are the few things that actually help me like get out of my head and focus on like, I built this desk because it was something that I had a weekend that I wanted to do something and not think about work. And that was one of the ways that I learned how I, as an individual, rest. And that was through the Enneagram.
One of the things that, like, what's interesting about that, especially for creatives, is I think back to like Hemingway. So Hemingway would get up 7, 8 in the morning, kind of thing, eat a nice big breakfast, grab coffee, kind of thing, and then he would sit down and he would write. And he would spend the rest of the morning writing. And his goal was to pump out like 1,000 or something words, right? Which is quite a bit for what he's doing. But then after that, he was done for the rest of the day. And for him, he wasn't sitting there reading. He didn't stay in his cabin. He actually got out and did things. He would go fishing. He would do things that gave him life. And his whole idea behind that was that in order for me to create, I have to experience the world around me. And if I'm not experiencing the world, and he was experiencing it in a way that was restful for him. He would go and he would sit at a coffee shop with friends when he lived in Paris for a bit. He would have coffee with friends, and he would enjoy the conversation that was there. He would watch people as they walked by. Like those sorts of things where he was getting out. Now, granted, we may not be able to do the coffee shop bit, but like getting out to go fishing, if you like fishing, go hiking, all of those sorts of things. But urban hiking at this point, because it's going to be snow, unless you like snowshoeing. Right?
Yeah.
the winter's going to be crazy. But those sorts of things, like you do your work and then you go get out and you rest and you are, and you do the things that give you life, that infuse creativity back into your being.
Yeah, it's that pendulum, right? Like rest work pendulum. Like it's more trying to get into getting into the space where you are working from rest rather than resting from work. Like that has kind of helped me frame like work is not the most important thing in life, right? Like for some people, sure, if that's like your entire identity, but like there's more to it than just like the job that we do. And we need to learn how to work from rest rather than resting from work. And the other thing that I thought was super insightful, there's a text message chain that I and a few others, I think Aaron, you're a part of this one, where someone had mentioned that their kid really enjoys Legos. And so over quarantine, they've been buying Legos. And they had said that the one thing that for her, that gets her away from thinking of COVID and like doing school from home and all these kinds of things is making Legos and playing with Legos. And then someone in that chain was asking, I wonder what my version is of like playing with Legos. And I think it's actually really insightful is like, what is the thing that like we do or are defaulting on? Maybe we don't know, or maybe we're already doing something that we're defaulting to. Like I said, retail therapy already. Like I'm sure there are many of us that I know there were many of us in the very early days of quarantine that were buying a lot of things. Partly I know that from conversations anecdotally, but then also because Amazon stock skyrocketed during the beginning of quarantine. So many of us were buying
Prime
things.
Day is coming. So like everybody's like, oh, they're finally about to announce the Prime Day. Like everybody's freaking out.
Yeah. So retail therapy is a thing that may have slipped in as the thing that like you attempted to do to rest and to escape and to get away from. So maybe it's part of it's identifying like what are those things that are presently unidentified that you are already doing to try to cope with everything. And then capturing that and say, is this something I want to continue to do? Or is this something that I want to work out of a habit and attempt to do something that maybe in a similar vein, but is a more healthy and productive version of whatever that is.
It's a stop-start, right? Like, what are you doing that you should stop, and what are you not doing that you should start? Like, what are your stop-starts? Like, taking stock of like your day and what it is that you're doing. Like this morning, our internet went out. I was so excited to sit down and read the news this morning. Like, just sit in my chair, have my coffee, and our internet was out when I woke up this morning. I was like, God, you're kidding me. So I was like, well, there goes my morning because I'm going to be doing this for the next 45 minutes, right? And it was that has become a very important rhythm for me of just my morning is consumed by sitting in a chair and drinking coffee and reading the news, just catching up on some things. Like it's enjoyable for me, but it also just kind of slows me down a little bit.
Yeah, and even like, so that's a great example of something that works for you and you have found like as an important routine and rhythm in your life and slowing you down may do the opposite for someone else, right? Like reading the news,
right?
Especially the news part. Maybe not so much like sitting in a chair and drinking coffee, but like the reading the news part might do the exact opposite. Because for me, there's been times where, and I typically do it at night, so I probably should flip that. But when I read the news at night, I just get like so like anxious and angry. Like I just read one sentence that Trump said, and I just want to throw my phone out the window. But like that's where each of us, like you, me, and everyone listening and watching, we have to learn like what are those rhythms that we have already, and how to identify them, and then how do we stop those that are actually benefiting us or not benefiting us.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of that, right? So like my practice of like reading the news it's typically headline scrolling. Like I use Apple News, and so I do a lot of headline scrolling, and then every so often I'll find a story that I'm actually like interested in reading, and so I'll pause and I'll read through it. But it becomes an act of prayer as well. So like that morning is consumed with like praying through the news. So that it is, so for me, it is actually like, it's not, it's like not panic inducing or anxiety inducing. It becomes moments of like repetitive prayer through the stories that are happening, the tragedies and things that are taking place. And then I oftentimes I spend time reading one long form article every day. So like that's the other part of it. So like it's not just like headline scrolling, but then like there's several long form stories that I want to read, several long form articles, and those are all bookmarked, and I make my way through each of those as like one a day, sometimes two if I've got time. One isn't as long.
Well, and even like the idea of reading through a long form article forces you to slow down and take in the story. Yeah. And also setting aside like 30-40 minutes to like get through an Atlantic, article. Yeah. So like that in and of itself is a slowing down practice in and of itself, beyond like headline scrolling, which is dangerous at times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Oh, so true. Yeah.
We've said the Enneagram a couple times now. I want to point out one of the great resources that I tend to go to for self-learning is the Enneagram, or I think it's just enneagraminstitute.com. And if you go there, it gives you, if you already know your type, that's kind of where I'm going at the moment. If you already know it, you can click on your type, and if you scroll down, you'll see the levels of development, as well as personal growth recommendations for your Enneagram type. And that's where I started in a lot of this, and I haven't visited in a while, so I should probably go back and like actually see what it says. I always know that Enneagram 5s are told to do yoga, but I have yet to do the Fitness Plus thing with Apple. Might actually suck me in, because it's combining like what I know I probably should do with like, here's a very techie, like fashionable version of it. And I'm like, oh, okay, now you're like speaking my language now.
Now you have no excuse.
Now I have no excuse.
Oh,
yeah, it's still a ways away. And we have to get Talissa an Apple Watch in order to actually like do it together. But I no longer have an excuse because I already have one. But yeah, like the Enneagram Institute is a great like starting place, both to learn about your type. I think there's a testing center, so you can take a test on the enneagraminstitute.com, as well as like learn about the type and then kind of go from there. But that's been a super helpful resource for me in like for what's the language they use? Personal growth recommendations. Yeah. Super helpful.
I think that's really good, because once you begin to understand like your type a little bit more, you begin to see what is actually necessary. Like you begin to see more and more like, oh, this is the thing that I've always known helps me rest, but now somebody is naming it for me. Somebody is putting it, somebody other than myself is saying that to me, right? So like I grew up understanding like introvert versus extrovert, right? So like the extrovert, like, oh, you get energy when you're with people, and you and that actually provides you rest. And an introvert, like, oh, you get rest when you're away from people, and that's what you need. And it's like, there's more to it than that. Like, there's other ways and other more embodied approaches to understanding like what you actually need because of who you are as an individual. And it's not a one size fits all. That's what's also great. It's like just because I'm an Enneagram 3 and I'm recommended to go sit in quiet in silence, and that's actually something that's beneficial for me. Like, that's actually proven to be true for me. Like, I tried it and it worked, but it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work for every 3, right? Like some other Enneagram 3s might be like, that was terrible. That was awful. Yeah. I couldn't shut anything out. I have to do it this way. And for a long time, for me, it was walking. Like, I had to do it while I was walking. So, like, prayer labyrinths had become a really important aspect of my prayer life, because I couldn't pray for long periods of time because I couldn't settle my mind enough to actually do anything, like to actually sit in prayer. And so prayer labyrinths became this really embodied approach for me, where I'm just walking. I don't have to pay attention to where I'm going or what I'm doing. I just kind of follow the lines of the ground. And that had been a really important tool of formation for me in terms of like how to pray, how to embody. It kind of lived in line with my Enneagram 3-ness at that time. I don't need them as much as I used to. I'm able to actually sit a little bit more. And I think that practice of the labyrinth actually helped me to not need it as much.
Yeah. Well, I think it's in part you are slowly building that muscle, right? Like if rest is a recommendation for an Enneagram 3 and you or sitting in silence, rest is a recommendation for everyone. Sitting in silence is a recommendation for an Enneagram 3, then and you haven't typically been in that environment, like it's going to take a while for that to be, and it probably never will be truly natural, because I think what we actually need in our rest is something that we have to work for. So you have to work to rest. That may be a controversial statement as I'm like saying it out loud, but we'll let it sit there for a minute. But I started thinking of rebuttals like immediately, and I was like, okay, so but like if it's something that it's just like any new habit. It's going to take a minute. It's going to take a while for you to like learn how to do it. And I think what's important is finding what that window is for you of, this has now gone on for X amount of time and it's no longer working. So then maybe it's time to change course. Instead of like giving up on it after like 2 weeks and then kind of moving on and say, oh, it didn't work. You kind of got to I think it's 60 days for habits to kind of form.
Please,
I think it's 60 or 90 days. It's somewhere in that
it takes like
ballpark.
3 to have it.
Yeah. Which then now you're getting into, there's one guy I watch on YouTube that is he's like a self-help guru kind of person. And one of the things he uses that I've tried to utilize every once in a while is the 2-day rule, because of the whole 3 days to break or to like stop a habit or whatever. It's the 2-day rule, where if you're trying to start a new habit, you don't let 2 days go by without not doing it. Okay. So if I wanted to start a habit of doing yoga, every day, I wouldn't let 2 days go by of not doing it. Well, that's kind of like a thing that you tell yourself.
There's permission in that too. Like, oh, I don't have to do it today.
Exactly.
I gotta do it tomorrow. So it builds in permission. That's really good.
Yeah, because I think so often we try to go from 0 to 100, right? We try to go like, I'm going to do this every day. And then you go for 2 weeks and then you're exhausted. And then you take a couple days, or even you take a day and then you feel guilty immediately. Yeah, this 2-day rule just gives you the permission to be like, okay, like take today. If you need to, you can take tomorrow, but don't let more than 2 days go by before you pick it back up again. So that's kind of a helpful self-help
That's
tip.
good, because like as I think about like the winter, I'm like, 90 days, I can start some pretty crazy habits in this space, right? Like it's like, but that's the 3 talking, where it's like, what am I going to achieve? What am I going to accomplish in 90 days? I'm going to take over the world, right? Like that sort of stuff, where it's like, hey, this is going to be awesome. But I think there's goodness in that too. Like there are some things that we could like pick up. Like if we stop and start, like there are some things that we can pick up in this season. But I think the key and maybe the core of it all too is the idea of like the core of what we've been talking about is rest. Like what is like, how do you rest? Because I think that what we're all going to experience in the winter is a very tense being. It's going to be 12 days of smoke on steroids, right? Like in hyper speed. And because of that, like I think learning what we need between now and basically November, right? Like we've got about 60 days to kind of figure out a little bit of like, what do I need to rest? But then getting that core nugget. So for me, it's quiet, it's silence. So I know that. Yeah. How on earth am I going to find quiet and silence in a 900 square foot apartment with a child that likes to jump all over the furniture, sprint around the house, that has school, and at various times just breaks out of the room and is like, I'm done! She's so excited about life. And like, so how then, like if that's what's core, like I need this for rest, this one thing, like how can I live into that? What rhythms or rituals or ideas can I start to percolate now so that I can get that later? Like, I mean, like on the non-rainy days, maybe I'll go walk up to Cary Park and sit there, like that sort of stuff. but like, what am I going to do when it's raining? Like, how am I going to? Like, am I just going to go take a drive? Am I going to go, drive into a national park for a little bit? Like,
yeah, and I think this might be like a type of situation where it might be very helpful to bring in. So you know how when we've talked about like the circle, it's meant to be done in community with like a close friend circle. I think this could be a very similar conversation because of the whole like you don't know what you don't know, right? And we're all trying to get creative on how do we rest, how do we work, how do we do these things, and it. I read a tweet recently where someone said, "If I hear unprecedented one more time," and so I just immediately caught myself trying to not say unprecedented. But we are in like unprecedented times where we don't know how to do this, right? And so having a community of people that you can get together and frame your conversation around like these kinds of things, like, how do you rest? This is how I rest. Okay, how can we get creative? And I can offer like suggestions of maybe here's a way that you can get away and get in silence, or maybe here's a way that you can like make something with your hands that, you know, doesn't cost a fortune, but is just kind of like a little trinket thing that you can make. I think that's going to be helpful more than just us trying to sit in silence and just kind of like twiddle our thumbs, trying to think of things. If we can actually have a conversation, either with those in your household, if you have a family and living with them, or if you're an individual, like getting people, even bringing people over within that 5 limit and all that jazz. And I think that's key too, is like in our current phase 2, like social gatherings are not allowed. So they're still allowed to happen, obviously done safely and social distancing and all these things. So like take advantage of that too. Especially if you're like living alone, or even if you're not, like getting together with other fellow people just periodically, safely. Don't have to say it. It's understood. But
I think what's interesting about this is like the past 6 months have been a formative experience for us. It has been formation, and I think the next 3 months plus are also going to be formation experiences. And so like. In some respects, maybe just to name this, what we're trying to do in this space is, like, let's set our intentions for the next 3 months. Like, let's set our intentions. Well, let's set our intentions for the next 2 months. Like, what are we intending to do to prepare for winter? But then let's set our intentions again for those 3 months. Like, what are we going to do to care for ourselves? And to form ourselves in different ways that breeds self-awareness, that brings an awareness and understanding of God and His space and how He is around us and here in these times, but how we're going to connect with Him, how we're going to connect with others, how we're going to connect with ourselves, how we're going to connect with the world around us. Like, how are we going to find all of those relationships in harmony, as opposed to perhaps what we've been experiencing in the past 6 months? This might just be me, but I feel like over the past month, we've found a little bit of settle. Like, we're finally starting to settle into these rhythms. And in some respects, I think it's been surrender too. Like, well, okay, it is what it is. We are where we are, and it's not going to change anytime soon. And now we're surrendering ourselves, whereas the formation that we've been experiencing over the past 6 months has been like to fight. Like we've been forming ourselves in the fight against what is happening, what we're experiencing. How can I break through? How can I find ways of being that are different? And now, like, it's like, oh no, we're surrendered to this. Let's set our intentions for those next 2 months. Like, what do I need in order to rest? What do I need in order to be mentally healthy moving forward? What do I need in these spaces? And then use those 3 months to put it into practice and really like use it as a spiritual formation and a personal formation season. Like that could be the thing that we're like let's just put that out there. That's what we're naming. That's the purpose of what we're doing right here. Is to set those intentions.
Yeah, and I think what you're naming, even over the last month or so of us like settling or realizing, in part I think could be surrendering, but I also think in part because of the larger conversation of systemic racism, and ever since George Floyd specifically and Breonna Taylor, like there was that immediate like fight or flight, right? Like we all just went in like guns blazing. But I think now we're starting to realize now we're at like what, over 90 days of protests. What are we at?
May 26th, I think, was the day.
So that was June, July, August. So we're at least 90 plus days.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of conversations saying that like solving racism, if you know, I know that in a statement in of itself is problematic, but is not a sprint, right? Like it's a marathon. Like we're not going to dismantle the systems by the end of the year. Like the election in November is not going to solve the issue. The inauguration is not going to solve the issue. Even 4 years from now, like we're so early in the process, especially for those white people among us that are just now entering this marathon, right? Like I think we've all started to kind of name that, and I think it's important to even say that like rest, and you've talked about on this last Sunday, that prayer is not a cop-out. It's not something that like the weak do or those that don't want to get involved. It's necessary to be able to do the work. So if we want to be able to dismantle things and build a better world with climate change and systemic racism and like so many things, we need to be able to rest so that we can work. That goes back to that pendulum, right? Yeah. Like you can't do the work if you are not rested. You will burn yourself out. We will drop dead, and then that which we are fighting against is going to win. And so we have to be able to rest, and rest well in order to. No, I think it's if we frame it that way, as I'm kind of talking, it's more of a way to frame it that this is an active way instead of like, let's just get through the pandemic, right? Let's just get through winter and wait until like, no, I think now more than ever, we can take advantage of the time that we're given. We can take advantage of what we have in front of us so that we can come out better and stronger by the summer and by the time the pandemic is over, and better as humans and people than if we just like passively wait by and just kind of like try to coast through.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be a year plus that we're in this thing. Like, there's no way that it's going to be all said and done in March. Based on, the head of the CDC and his kind of testimony from last week, it's going to be longer. Like, he was saying Q2, Q3, maybe Q4 kind of thing. Like, he backtracked to Q2, the end of Q2. Like, it's like, well, come on. Like, just give us the straight facts here. And and that's before the vaccine is really out there. Yeah. And who knows? Like,
and that's just one piece of the puzzle, right? Like, that's the pandemic. Yeah. That's not even counting climate change, systemic racism. Like, there's so many other things
that's all of which are
going to go away.
Right? And I think that's some of the challenge. So we have a real a danger of being just like overly fatigued, because every single one of these are immediates, right? Like systemic racism is an immediate. Climate change is an immediate. Like there's a clock. Somebody put it on Facebook. Like one of the buildings in New York used to have like a countdown clock for something, and they turned it into or had a clock moving forward. Maybe it was the national debt one. I don't know. And it's now a countdown clock for climate change as to when it's like a reversible thing. And it's an immediate thing. Like it's big solutions are necessary for that. And there's not a whole lot of time left to do that. And hey, there's a pandemic, which is also an immediate thing that has now killed over 200,000 Americans and millions worldwide. It's just like, that's a big deal.
And these are like complex emotions to work through too. So that's where like, I mean, you and I can do our best to offer some kind of advice, but again, like it could get into like mental health kind of categories where actual professionals would probably be better at handling a lot of what we're talking about. But I think,
that's something too to point out. Like if that might be rest for you, seeking out a mental health professional in this season, like utilizing some of your company benefits to sit down with the therapist and just have at it. And that might be something that's necessary in the season, and that's okay, and that's good.
Yeah.
Do it, use it. It's there.
Yeah.
It's important. That's what they're there for.
Yeah, and they'll be able to walk through like how to do this, because like we're talking self-help stuff, right? Like this is stuff that we read and like, oh, this is anecdotally what I found to work.
Exactly.
Whereas an actual professional will know like here's like an evidence-based solution for your problem, rather than just like some guy on the internet saying, well, I heard that one day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we are at our 45 minutes, so we will pick this conversation back up again next week, Tuesday at 4, here on Facebook Live and on YouTube. This audio will be found on the Awake My Soul podcast soon. And so you can find that at awakemysoulpodcast.com. I'm giving this plug at the end, like either you watched it or you've already listened to the whole thing anyways. So probably too little, too late at this point, but
if somebody came late.
There you go. Yeah, it's live. So someone came in late, so you can go back and watch the whole or listen to the whole thing if you want to listen to it. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching along with us, and we'll catch you next week.